So this is an icon, and it is from a book, and the title of the book is Cosmo Dolphins. So and it is a book on feminism, all right? So I'm using this icon to convey the message that research in the contemporary age has to be, so research in this contemporary world cannot but be interdisciplinary in approach. And when I talk about interdisciplinarity, there are some basic misconceptions about interdisciplinarity. For example, when I just share a recent experience I had. When people talk about ADHD and such mental aberrations or mental deviances, and they sort of talk about its portrayal on screen and in books. For example, there's a book called The Many Minds of Billy Milligan about multiple personality problems and all that. And that was a movie also. The movie was directed by Manoj Knight Shyamalan, and it was titled The Split. So the problem is that for us, our knowledge of psychiatry is very limited. And we cannot go up and tell people, look, this is what schizophrenia is, or that is what ADHD is, or that is what multiple personality is. That is something that we cannot possibly do with our knowledge of the subject, because our knowledge of the subject is very limited, and it is reflected through literature. So the best we can do is to get some sort of idea about the methods used by psychologists and psychiatrists, and then try to look at whether how this is reflected in the literary text also. So that is a problem, all right? It is not that we are unaware of the problem, that we cannot be masters of many disciplines. But what I am trying to tell you now is that many universities, including the MG University and Calicut University, they are encouraging interdisciplinarity in research, because, you know that literature is a multidisciplinary area. You have reflections from different fields of knowledge shown in the form of a text, whether it's a novel or a movie. So let us come back to this particular, this particular slide, and it's called Cosmo Dolphins. So, the problem with my presentation is that my slides are not very easy to follow at this point of time, but I will share the slides. I know that some of you said that perhaps you could show a PPT while presenting, but that can be rather distracting, because that PPT is just what I look at when I refer. I just wanted you to look at this particular picture. And that's a book. The book is called Cosmo Dolphins, and it is about applying available knowledge about gender and the environment to research in science and technology. And this book explores the relationships with the wild with nature, that which is left natural. And the authors analyze contemporary categorization of the human self through 20th century icons like spaceships and dolphins. So this picture, the picture of these two dolphins jumping up in the air, was taken by McCullough. And let me just explain this picture. It merges the earthbound and the extraterrestrial. So we find that popular culture is fascinated by these two. The coming together. This is all about, you find this plenty in science fiction as well, where the earthbound or the terrestrial creatures and the extraterrestrial creatures somehow meet at some common point. So you have two creatures, two mammals, in a rather strange border zone between water and air. So the environment is artificial, because you find the infrastructure to launch a spaceship right in the background of the dolphins. So the questions that are being asked are many. Is the artificial environment an indication that these mammals are cyborgs? Or are they jesters, or people who mock at these things and who expose the contemporary ambivalence of the civilized self and the wild other? So are we saying that we are civilized and something else is wild? And is this, Derrida spoke about a scandal that was found in Levi-Strauss. So is it something like that, whether are they challenging these artificial boundaries? So there are multiple questions which can be raised based on this iconic photograph. And let me just go on into the picture. Yes. Right. So these are the questions that are raised by the single picture of the Cosmo Dolphins. And like I said, the background is about the launching of a spaceship. So it is an artificial sort of situation in which these very, very natural creatures are positioned. So the entire book, like I said, talks about feminism and placing feminism in this particular zone where multiplicities are converging. So at the outset, let us just talk about the categorizations of such research. It's very simple: intradisciplinary, single discipline, cross-disciplinary. You're viewing one discipline from the perspective of another. Multidisciplinary, people from different disciplines like history, sociology, mathematics, or physics are working together, and they're each drawing on their disciplinary knowledge. So that is multidisciplinary. What is interdisciplinary then? Interdisciplinary is integrating knowledge and methods from different disciplines using a synthesis of approaches. So first, I'll give you the definitions, the categorization of what it means to do interdisciplinary research, and then I will go on to give you examples using text as well as examples using methodology. And finally, you have transdisciplinary. That is what is aimed at. It is about creating a unity of intellectual frameworks which are beyond the disciplinary perspectives. So we at the moment are only focusing on interdisciplinary, that is integrating knowledge and methods from different disciplines using a real synthesis of approaches. So when I go into this, you will realize that how important it is to do research in this manner, because otherwise it is very clear that what we do as research is very limited. And when I talk about recent efforts in the world of creative writing also, you will realize that focusing or confining yourself to the boundaries of one single discipline is not going to give you a really comprehensive outlook towards this sort of, a probing question actually. So, interdisciplinary studies involves a combination of two or more academic disciplines into one activity. It draws knowledge from several fields. That is something you already know. And Elizabeth Dzeng, if you want, you can just note down this name. She has written extensively about doing interdisciplinary research within the domain of English literature. Elizabeth Dzeng, Elizabeth Zeng, we could call her. And she says, regarding English as an interdisciplinary subject means to share a space where unashamedly diverse views come together and sit alongside one another. So at one single table, you have different guests. And she says, English is a subject that demands methodological promiscuity. So I hope you understand. So methodologically, you are free to draw from different disciplines. And there is nothing wrong in it. Rather, this is the way to do it. Okay. So due to a rigidly compartmentalized higher education framework, disciplines tend to be more willing to judge other disciplines' procedures and results rather than engage in such a self-aware and collaborative process as an interdisciplinary dialogue. As a consequence, in contemporary universities, sometimes it is very difficult to sort of launch into interdisciplinary approaches. So, success in interdisciplinarity results from the synthesis of disciplinary knowledge as well as methods, the result of which can be valuable insights or answers to shared topics and questions. To achieve this, there are preliminary requirements of accepting, understanding, articulating, accessible formulations, the differences between the disciplines engaged in the study. So the first requirement is, of course, communicability. That is, each discipline has its own technical language, which we call jargon. So it is not that one should understand these technical concepts. That is, the explanation should be there. And therefore, we do not want the simplification of the terminology. We do not want the standards of a discipline to be abandoned. Rather, there should be a willingness to explain disciplinary specific terms and concepts. That is something which is very specific to that particular discipline, but there should be an ability to communicate this. And you can use accessible examples and elucidate points that one might not expect to have to do so with a familiar disciplinary crowd. And for interdisciplinary discussion to occur, what you should do is construct accessible and acceptable intellectual frameworks. So here, they talk about something called the threshold concept. So this is quite important, because when you start doing this sort of research, you should first actually get into the text, then decide what are the different disciplines that would afford you a clear idea about what is going on. And then you look for something called the threshold concepts. I'll give you a detailed explanation of what a threshold concept is. So a threshold concept opens up a new and previously inaccessible way of thinking about something. It represents a transformed way of understanding or interpreting something without which the learner cannot move forward. So such a transformed view may represent how people think in a particular discipline, how they perceive, how they apprehend or experience particular phenomena within that discipline. To make it clear, now let us look at the way history would look at a particular event, and let us look at the way sociology would look at that event. They might be using different tools of analysis to conceptualize a particular event at some point of time. But when we find this event reflected in literature, our methodology will be very different. So what they're trying to tell you is that you should borrow from other disciplines as well and use their methodology and create these bleeding frameworks, which means that you should not sort of build walls around your discipline. Then your idea of the event will not be complete, and you will be doing something which is very, very one-sided. For example, when Edward Said writes about Orientalism, he is not just taking into consideration race and raciology alone. He's taking into consideration the entire colonial enterprise, which involves finance, which involves economics, then involves race also. So all these things come together inside Orientalism, and that is used to problematize literature as well. So I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. So that is just one example. There are multiple such examples. And the thing is that for a long period of time, we were content to borrow from allied disciplines like sociology and history and economics. But recently, the trend is towards borrowing or using the disciplinary ideas put forward by hard sciences like physics and mathematics. And of course, psychiatry medicine was always there. So threshold concepts are transformative, which means they lead to significant and sometimes irreversible shifts in perception. Once you use this, no longer will your perception be the same. And it is integrative. What does it mean? That is, what was earlier hidden, the interrelatedness that was earlier hidden is now integrated. And it is conceptually difficult. It is not easy because it is a borderline area. Therefore, it is not easy to understand or sort of embark on this sort of methodology. So it disrupts a lot of things. Interdisciplinarity disrupts a lot of things, and particularly when you think of the threshold becoming a liminal area, which is neither inside nor outside. It disrupts traditional notions of research roles and relationships, dominant approaches to collection of data, traditional notions of representing and disseminating research findings. And also, like I said at the outset, it bleeds disciplinary boundaries. Now, for example, let us take a look at the novel Beloved. That is Toni Morrison's Beloved. Now, can anybody here tell me something about this particular novel? If any one of you has done this for your UG or PG, can you just tell me what Beloved is all about? Anybody? Nobody has done it. Because otherwise, this doesn't make sense. No, none of you have done it. Okay. So, Beloved actually is sort of dealing with the idea of slavery based on race and the pseudoscience of raciology. So with Beloved, you have the threshold concepts of the novel. That is, you are recuperating hidden histories, the slave narrative, you could say. the slave narrative, which was not part of the dominant historical discourse. Then you have realism, the Gothic and the imaginary. And you also take a close look at the extracts from the novel. And these are very different areas. Like realism is not the same as Gothic, and that is not the same as the imaginary. So all these things function as a mode of resistance in the novel. And this, you find this is coming from a trajectory of slave narration. And this, again, you're taking oral histories, oral testimonies, and integrating that into the research. Now, this again is quite simple, and this is something that you must have already done. Right. Let me just go on to another example. Yeah, for example, there's something called neurofeminism. We realized that in the second wave, during the second wave, feminists began using the sex-gender distinction to emphasize that the psychological and the behavioral characteristics associated with masculinity and femininity were the products of differences in socialization experiences. And these are gender characteristics, unlike the physical characteristics associated with being male or female. The Simone de Beauvoir's famous statement, one is not born, rather one becomes a woman. So there was a clear dichotomy there. The biological determination on one side and the sociological superstructure on the other side. So the emphasis on socialization was meant to combat earlier notions of biological determinism. The biological determinism put forward the idea that the male and female characteristics are stereotypical, and these are the results of biology, because the physical differences give rise to these behavioral differences also. But in the second wave of feminism, the gender differences were attributed to culture or the environment. And the feminists wanted to emphasize that it was social institutions themselves designed to perpetuate gender inequality that produced the differences between men and women. Changes designed to eliminate gender inequality in social institutions would also eliminate gender differences. I hope you understand. So once the notion of patriarchy is dismantled, then gender differences would cease to exist, is what tacitly the second wave of feminists were trying to say. But if that were true, the social origin of most of the differences between men and women would be well established, which means there would not be any ambiguity there. So associating biological with sexual differences was found to be problematic. And biological differences were thought to be innate and unchangeable. So the argument goes thus: if this is true, then biological differences between men and women must also be innate and immutable. So if behavioral differences can be associated with biological differences, they too become natural and immutable. So Ruth Dowell and Helen Longino characterized this type of reasoning as rooted in the linear model of development. So feminist approaches to neurosciences have evaluated. Every day you have these different ideas emerging about not just the neurosciences, but also about the biology, the DNA. You have new ideas which are emerging. And feminist approaches, interlinking the available information from neurosciences, have evaluated the debates surrounding the practices of knowledge production within and research results of contemporary brain research. And they have critically examined gendered impacts of neuroscientific research. So it is not easy, as it was at one point of time, to very blithely say, no, biological determinism should be pushed aside, and all we are concerned about is social determination. But now they say that no, we do not know enough about biology to make such sweeping statements, and therefore we must go deeper into neurosciences and the research that has been done in those areas to get an idea about this. So I hope you understand. The ideology itself has to question the basic premises that it had put forward at a particular point of time because of scientific interventions or later changes in science and the ideas regarding the human body, which is again very, very fleeting. So critical work on contemporary neurocultures that has highlighted the entanglements of neuroscientific research within society and the implications of neurofacts for gendered cultural symbolisms, social practices, and power relations. So neurofeminism analyzes the portrayal of not only these gender binaries and gender multiplicities, but also how it is portrayed in popular media. So the idea is that you at least have to read something about research based on gender that is going on in the field of neurosciences, and you have n number of critics, critics like Karan Barad, who are being trained in physics, but then they talk about feminism as well, and they use the ideas from physics to talk about feminism, like agential realism and all that. I'll come to that in a different lecture, but just realize that there are people like Karan Bharat who have used the terminology of the hard sciences to talk about ideologies like feminism. So no longer can we shut the doors of our classrooms and say that, no, that is not English literature. How dare you come in here? Because unless and until you have a basic knowledge of what is going on there, we are very, very dated when we still cling on to Simone de Beauvoir or Kate Millett and say that, no, this is it. But I'm not questioning them. At that point of time, with the available knowledge, with the knowledge corpus that was available to them, they did create a paradigm shift in society. And even now, there are neuroscientists that firmly believe that gendering is actually very social and biological factor is very little. But there are arguments there are debates there, and one cannot establish what Boer said, that it is for all time. Boer is being questioned, and we have to move on with that knowledge, with that idea that the basic premises of the second wave feminism are being questioned. So Rebecca Jordan Young. So that is another, critic who's also used these scientific metaphors and shown that the brain organization theory, she says, still dominates much of the development neurobiology. There is another way also. This is a reciprocal relationship. If neurosciences have influenced the ideology of feminism, the basic ideologies of feminism have also influenced certain people working in these gender-related areas. So she says that Rebecca Jordan Young says that the influence of this line of explanation, this brain organization theory, and the equation of sex difference to biological difference, people are tempted to conclude that the kinds of psychological and behavioral differences claimed by feminists to be gender differences and thus to social factors are actually sex differences and the result of unfolding of inevitable biological processes. I hope you can understand. This may be a little, strange to you. It is not difficult at all. It is just not, we're not used to this sort of language. We're not used to this sort of discussions, and perhaps we need to open our minds out more to such ideas. And I'm sure almost all of you, young women and men, you must have done something related to chaos theory and complexity theory. And I'm sure that your teachers would have told you how connected it is to physics. That is an area I'll discuss later. I'm just talking about it, when you talk about chaos theory and complexity theory and how you sort of read text using those perspectives, it is not just something you find in literary classrooms. You find that outside the literature classrooms as well. You have to borrow the disciplinary jargon used by physics. Yeah. Feminist neuroscience. So again, like I said, the opposite way. Like if neurosciences has affected feminist ideologues, feminist neuroscientists in their field were the first to critique androcentric theories and assumptions in their disciplines, making neuroscience an important site for what Harding is a person who speaks about standpoint epistemology, Sandra Harding, and she calls it spontaneous feminist empiricism. And Elizabeth Anderson, I'll give you a list of these names, not to worry. Elizabeth Anderson suggests that the central concept of feminist epistemology and the philosophy of science is that knowers are situated and therefore so is their knowledge. I hope this answers your questions. Some of you asked me, what is objectivity in research? So this is what it is said, the knowers are situated within the context. And the knower and the knowledge are very closely interconnected. Therefore, the possibility of complete objectivity is probably ruled out in that sense. So like I said, all we can hope for is an inclusive model of thinking. There is no way that we can remove ourselves from the field like a disinterested observer and say that, you know, everything that I am talking about regarding this particular event or regarding this particular text is objective. That is certainly not a possibility according to Elizabeth Anderson. In the case of neuroscience research, which is very complex and which aims to link biology with psychology and behavior, these aspects of feminist philosophy of science are particularly useful and important. So this is something else. You might feel that these are very strange and very rarely occurring terms, but no, when you read books that have been published after 2018 and 19, such areas constantly recur in these books as themes. So this is another area called neuro art history. So I'm following a particular, trajectory here. So neuro art history is a term coined by Professor John Onions, who's an art historian. All right, he is an art historian, and according to him, neuro art history is an approach that concerns the neurological study of artists, both living and dead. So he taught the postgraduate model art and the brain, and he says using neuroimaging and the neurobiological processes of artists, and to understand. And there is a book called Neuro Art History from Aristotle to Pliny to Zeki. If you are interested, you can find this book. And Professor Onions has said that neuro art history can be used both to better understand the nature of familiar artistic phenomena such as style and to crack the intractable problems such as what is the origin of art. And according to Onions, neuro art history can explain why Florentine painters made more use of these strong lines and Venetian painters made more use of color. The reason is that the neural plasticity ensured the passive exposure to different natural and man-made environments caused the formation of different visual preferences. And neuroaesthetics, so this is very closely allied to this. And the innovations of technology in recent decades and functional magnetic resonance imaging that can give a concrete picture of what is going on in the brain, scientists are increasingly able to peer into realms of the human experience that were once thought to be totally abstract and intangible. The question of beauty is something that science has shied away from as it didn't seem answerable or definable. But with neuroaesthetics, science is sort of moving into the domain of aesthetics and try to find a logical rationale as to why certain people think in a particular manner. All right, so that is one area which is again connected with science, with technology. And when I talk about digital culture and digital writing and digital reading and the use of the cyber networking, again, these ideas will come in use for you. So just keep this somewhere at the back of your mind that there are areas in which are doing investigations, connecting it to certain ideologies and connecting it to the concept of aesthetics also. So these are very, very new fields, emerging fields, all right? Now, so I'm moving into something called geopolitics. Again, I'm sure all of you have done your spatial theory. All of you know the major spatial theorists like Soja, Harvey, Lefebvre, all these people. So with that knowledge, which I think you already have, I'm just talking about something called geopolitics. Yeah, geopolitics is deeply critical of this Western-centric thinking and the separation that has resulted of human beings from the rest of the natural world. And geopolitics proposes that the universe is a potentially integral whole, and the various domains into which knowledge has been separated can be unified by a poetics which places planet Earth at the center of experience. So instead of having a human-centered experience, you have an Earth-centered experience. And if you read Margaret Atwood and Sarah Joseph, what you find in their works, I hope you know Margaret Atwood. Sarah Joseph, maybe the people from Kerala would know, but Margaret Atwood, the Canadian writer who's written extensively about nature, her works, I think, would be quite easily categorized as works which demonstrate geopolitics. Yeah, one second. Let me just explain that too. And when I talk about geopolitics and when I talk about earth-centered experience, this comes from a particular mode of thinking called posthumanism. So these are all areas within the domain of posthumanism. But unfortunately, what happens when we talk about posthumanism is we automatically link it with robotics. We link it to aliens and we link it to cyborgs. But that is only one aspect of posthumanism. It is called transhumanism. But I thought, I would devote an entire lecture to posthumanism because it's a very wide area and it's a very important area as well. Because I don't think that, it's like at certain in the 60s and the 70s, without knowing what deconstruction was, you couldn't actually learn to read anything because that was a major theory then. And now there has been a huge paradigm shift in the way people think about themselves and the world at large. And I think, therefore, we should talk more about posthumanism. So please realize that geopolitics is a particular dynamics of the umbrella term called posthumanism. So, yeah. It looks for signs of those who have attempted to leave the motorway of the Western civilization in the past. And you find them, and they're people like Nietzsche, Thoreau, and they are called intellectual nomads. Again, this can be connected to Rosie Bradotti's nomadic theory, which again I will be speaking about later. So geopolitics seeks a new or renewed sense of the world and a sense of space, light, and energy. So why is geopolitics so important here? Because within the domain of geopolitics, we definitely have to have some idea about climate change, about the environment. Environmental studies is important, and these natural hard sciences also give us a lot of information of why the planet has changed. And if you just look at a novel and say, oh, this is about climate change, it wouldn't probably make sense. I do not know if you have read Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island. It's a very simple novel, and it's not voluminous unlike Amitav Ghosh's other novels, and it's a sort of environmental whodunit, and there are multiple spaces in the text where convergence is a very important idea, and it talks at length about dolphins. So unless and until we also know something about the behavior patterns of dolphins, Amitav Ghosh's The Gun Island would be quite incomprehensible to us. So it no longer is novel reading and armchair reading. It is highly demanding. And at many a time, and particularly now, because we do not use paperback books, perhaps we use, it is best that we use Kindle and online reading material, because searching after illusions is very simple then, because each segment probably will refer to something which we know nothing about. And it's not just based on the writer's imagination. It's based on a particular event. It is based on a scientific pronouncement. And therefore, it is very easy for us to go into those areas if you are reading a book online. And perhaps that can be an area of research also. When you look at a book, does it yield to be a hypertext? And is it meant to be read only as a hypertext, and why? In which case, I would say that T.S. Eliot's Wasteland is a very, very explicit case where it can yield itself into the format of a hypertext, because that is the easiest way to read the Wasteland. So that, again, that is a possible system of inquiry. What type of books are written now, and are they written with the modality in mind, the container in mind? And that is what actor network theory talks about. The container in which you tell the story, the container in which you convey the message, is as important as the message itself, put forward by Bruno Latour. So all those areas are highly interdisciplinary, and that is what, and again, from my next lecture onwards, I'll be talking in depth about those things. And therefore, I thought it is necessary for you to have an overview of what is meant by interdisciplinary research, and giving you concrete examples of how it is attempted. It seeks to express that sensitive and intelligent contact with the world by means of a poetics, that is a language drawn from a way of being, which attempts to express reality in different ways. Oral expression, writing, visual arts, music, and combinations of different art forms. So just keep this in mind. Visuality in culture, visuality in literature, visuality in the novel is very, very important. And I have a particular, PPT regarding visuality in literature. I will be dealing with that later. In case I forget, just remind me. But this is where, so in case you are thinking about, now how is this different from ecofeminism? How is this different from eco-aesthetics? Well, ecofeminism has its own set of issues, because ecofeminism, the main grouse against ecofeminism was that it tended to essentialize the issue. That is, it tended to sort of bring it down to the old binary, that women and nature are aligned, and nature doesn't change, right? It is cyclical, and therefore the characteristics of women also do not change. This was the basic premise that was given forth in ecofeminism, and that was the reason why there were a lot of problems with it. All right, and geopoetics addresses the idea of ecology, addresses the idea of human space in ecology from a more holistic perspective. And the gender differentiation isn't that marked. And geopoetics also makes use of not just the printed word, but other types of writing as well. Other types of writing, other types of discourse as well, particularly giving importance to the visual culture and the oral narratives. It involves coming together of a network of energies. And you have this International Institute of Geopoetics and its various centers where disparate disciplines of knowledge can converge in a common concern about the planet and a shared project to develop an understanding of geopoetics and apply it in different fields of research and creative work. So this is the question that geopoetics asks. It's a very, very interesting question. They ask, how is it with the world? Hey, world, are you fine? And it is not the exclusive domain of poets and thinkers. For example, you look at Thoreau. Thoreau was an ornithologist and a meteorologist. As much he was a poet. And he included the sciences, or his knowledge of the sciences, within his poetics. And the link with biology is just as necessary, and with an ecology, including mind ecology, well-grounded and well-developed. So geopoetics provides not only a place that is proving very necessary, where poetry, science, and thought can come together in a climate of reciprocal inspiration, but a place where different disciplines can converge. We're talking about convergence. And this is what Zizek talks about when he uses the metaphor of quilting. I do not know how many of you are familiar with Zizek, but there is this article where he talks about the idea of quilting, where a certain point holds together multiplicities. And this point keeps altering. All right? And once they are ready to leave restricted frameworks and enter into global cosmological, cosmopoetic space, one question is paramount. A whole network then can come into being. Once you break up these disciplinary boundaries, what is the result? The result is a network, a new network of energy, desire, competence, and intelligence. So I hope you have understood these ideas. Probably slightly difficult at this point of time if you are not exposed to this sort of thinking, but I just want you to understand that these are current, these are contemporary logics or contemporary rationale in multiple fields, and maybe a time will come when we cannot actually talk about doing post-graduation a single discipline, because that will be rather limiting. At this point of time, I know you're concerned about the admin and how a particular research project will be thrown out if it doesn't actually refer to a primary text written in the field of literature. And I think, this liminality of disciplinary discourses can be easily found if you walk into a bookshop. Now, certain books which we think to be fiction are shelved as biographies. And certain books that we feel is literature is a purely science, is shelved with literature books. So these sort of shifts are happening constantly. And we have a plethora of books that cannot be strictly classified as belonging to one single discipline. And a very, very clear example of this is a book which won the Booker. I briefly mentioned it yesterday. It's called The Flights, and it was written by the Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk. It is unclassifiable. It won the Booker because it's a novel, right? Because it is said to be a novel. Booker is given for fiction, but it is unclassifiable. Why? Because if you read this book, you understand that It is intermittently a work of fiction, but an exercise in theory, cultural anthropology. It is also a memoir. I hope you understand. So Flights becomes the icon of contemporary novels, where you need to have a working knowledge of many areas. And that is why I said, no, perhaps such novels yield to hypertext rather than to paperbacks. Because when you're sitting and reading all by yourself without an internet connection, we will not have much knowledge about cultural anthropology. We do not have that sort of resources with us. So the narrator, I'm just going into the book now, the narrator, who's a Polish writer, unnamed, the narrator is unnamed. And there's an unappeasable need to travel. The person wants to go on traveling. That is the only interest. And the book has been called an omnium gatherum, which means a big book full of peculiar parts. So within the book, you have mini essays on airports, the psychology of travel, guidebooks, the pleasures of a single Polish word, no? How this word has different resonances. All these things are found in this book. And what are the book's themes? The two themes are twinning the fictional and the non-fictional. And the two pillars of fiction and non-fiction are brought together using two ideas. One is mobility and one is curiosity. Moving and always seeking for knowledge. So you're noticing, you're theorizing often brilliantly. And this mode could be called flanneurial essays. I suppose you know who a flaneur is. If you have read G. Thiel's Narcopolis, very clearly you have a flaneur there, a person who walks. It is actually was used by Michael de Certeau and all those spatial writers. And they spoke about a person who walks the city at night. And when you walk the city at night, the perspective that you get of the city is completely different. So this entire novel can be called a flaneurism, where you're wandering through different areas, different spaces, looking at it, conceptualizing it, theorizing it, so that it makes more sense to you. Yeah, so like I said, the novel has many short essays, and one essay is about Wikipedia. And the writer, Olga, rightly praises the Wikipedia and calls it a wonder of the world, a project to gather the entire globe's knowledge. And in the second paragraph, she changes course. And she says that the problem with Wikipedia is that it can contain only what we can represent in words. So I would like you to connect it to what we earlier spoke about, which is geopolitics. So our knowledge about geopolitics can be used to understand this novel of Olga. And I just quote from that novel. She says, we should have some other collection of knowledge to balance that one out. What is that one? That sort of knowledge which can only be contained in words. So there should be another collection of knowledge. It's inverse. Everything that we do not know. See, so if Wikipedia is a collection in words of everything that we do know, there should be a collection of everything that we don't know. Things that can't be captured in any index, can't be handled by any search engine. For the vastness of these contexts cannot be traversed from word to word. Information and anti-information. So you have that is one book that I wanted to talk to you about. I hope you have understood the logic of using Olga Takar's books, Flights, in order to understand how reading becomes a multi-dimensional activity. So let alone research, even to read such a book, you need to have a wide variety of knowledges inside you. And and she brilliantly uses Wikipedia, doesn't she? Because she knows fully well that the moment the person starts to read the Flights, the first location to which that we would travel mentally and visually would be to Wikipedia. And therefore, she foregrounds the space of Wikipedia as well. So there is plenty of room for research. You can bring out excellent research questions based on this book, all right? And to understand this book, definitely we realize that and interdisciplinary knowledge or approach is necessary. Now, another book which I would like to briefly talk about is Rootedness, the Ramifications of a Metaphor. And this is a brilliant book because, and it very closely relates to us, people who deal in the business of teaching and learning English literature, written by Christy Wampole. And the book focuses on roots and rootedness, being fixed into a place. So please remember that, when you think about roots, a whole lot of imageries come to our mind. The traveler, the migrant, the exodus, the itinerant laborers that you find in India, and the picture of the itinerant laborers who were forced out of their homes, the shelters, when COVID struck. I hope you remember the terribly heartbreaking pictures of the people who were taking to the roads, walking to their homeland. And the question, what does rootedness mean? How does the root differ from other metaphors for origin? What does the constant use of this metaphor say about the human being's relationship to the botanical world? So these are the questions that are raised in the book called Rootedness, the Ramifications of a Metaphor. And the relationship between the Judaic religion and the trope of rootlessness, the Semitic movement, the search for a homeland, and that is one of the religions which is very closely connected with the trope of rootlessness and one of the most well-researched aspects of the root metaphor. So I hope you're getting my point. The point is actually just this. Looking at the metaphor of a root, you envisage how the human mind has started thinking in terms of the root. And what does the root convey? And what has the root meant for human beings? And how have we related ourselves to nature? And it begins from the idea of the Semitic religion that we're in search of a homeland. So this is how convergence works. Into a single metaphor, you're bringing in multiple ideas. And this again, you use the word root, but perhaps this is the iconic representation would be brilliantly done by Deleuze and Guattari when they spoke about the rhizome. So whether it is the rhizome or whether it is this idea of the root and rootlessness and the multiplicities that converge, the idea is of plurality. The idea is of multi-valences. And there is no particular dimension which is more valid than the other. They are all equally valid. So conceptions of spiritual, intellectual transcendence in European thought are predicated on rootedness. So this book is written by a Westerner, and therefore definitely Christy Wampole's perspective would also be Western. So like I said yesterday, we could actually contextualize it. Now, how have Indians looked at the concept of root and rootlessness, and how have we pictured the people without a root? You have these wandering sages on one hand and the landlords on the other. So we can think of a spatial distribution based on our idea of rootedness. So, and if you go through this book, you have a plethora of ideas. Like I spoke about the Judaism, then you have identity for politics stemming from the fallout of European colonialism. And you have metaphors of uprooting, transplantation, vegetal invasion. And the paganistic idea of human embeddedness in nature gets refashioned time and again, lyricized through literature, legitimated through politics, philosophy, and science. And there is something very compelling in the root as a metaphor that it has ceased to be recognized as such. So what they mean is that suddenly you don't think of the root as a metaphor at all. So I will not go deeper into it. I have I'll send you this PPT which has enough and more about this book. And I'll just briefly mention one poem, Denis Levertov. I hope you've heard of her, Levertov. Denis Levertov's Rerouting. It's a small poem. It describes beautifully the ways that technology in the form of the trench digger, the pesticide, has decontextualized the human, giving the impression that all our problems can be solved through scientifically informed mechanisms, yet doing nothing to alleviate the generalized sense of alienation. So, like I just gave you two examples of two books. There are other books as well, but I do not think I'll go into that now because I am saving it for some other lectures, like posthumanism and all that. I'll be speaking about it then. And now I would like to briefly talk about what has happened to the human world in the midst of the COVID pandemic. All right, and this can take up different dimensions, actually, different dynamics, actually. And perhaps if we have time, we could also look at how you can use Foucault's models of illnesses, the leprosy model, the tubercular model, and try to conceptualize how the COVID model has structured human life. And I think this is quite, I'll just give you these pointers because I'm too old, I guess, to be doing research and all that now. But perhaps you may be able to write papers about it or discuss these things. And therefore, I'll just give you a couple of pointers as to how the contagion has been conceptualized and how, you cannot just talk about the contagion as a medical problem. You have the world of community medicine itself brings into its ambit political structures, economic structures, cultural dynamics. All these things would come into it. And of course, the power structure, and bodies that are able and not able. That is one, disabled. Another thing, bodies which are said to be important and bodies which are not that important. So you have this hierarchizing of the human body itself, which was always there. You had women who are not as important as men, caste-based hierarchy, gender-based hierarchy. But then we sort of thought that with democracy, all this has changed. But within the COVID pandemic, we now have come to the realization that, yes, some lives are more privileged than the others. And in case of an emergency, we saw that in Italy. We saw that in the Western countries, the so-called fully developed Western countries, that when there was a glut of patients in the hospital, certain bodies were privileged over the others. So how long do you give a ventilator to a 40-year-old man? Or do you give it to an 80-year-old man? If there's one ventilator, who does the hospital choose to be allowed to die? Necropolitics, right? Where you're talking about the right not of life, but the right to kill. So all these dynamics come within the idea of the contagion. I may not have time to go into that in great detail, but I'll just briefly talk about the idea of the contagion. The uncontrollability and the unknowability of the contagion. Its surprise appearance in other bodies, in other places. And this invites systems of control and knowledge. Hence the huge scientific and bureaucratic machine of public health, touching on so many levels of conduct and social organization, from the personal and the local to the national and the international. And you have various lines of hygiene that are drawn to contain circulating dangers and to render particular subjects or spaces safe or immune. They also elaborate on the ways in which these cultural, political, social efforts fail. And this fantasy of controlling the contagion, this dream of hygienic containment, has strongly marked modern history and culture. The control of a contagion is a dream in two senses. So I am now asking you to look at the contagion only from the perspective of the power structure. How has a power structure through history looked at contagion and the control of contagion? So why is it called a dream in two senses? There are very real reasons for containment and prevention, and reasons more valid than the imperative of national security and economic productivity, which is the pain, the actual physical pain that a contagious disease gives the body, the treatment, the unpredictability of the epidemics, the deaths, and the social dislocation. So these are very real factors. But the dream, what is these writers, when they talk about the dream of containment, mean? It suggests the impossibility of total hygienic containment, for contagion always exceeds measures for prevention. It is this capacity for excess that sustains the fascination of contagion in the cultural imagination of the West. So if you look at science fiction novels, science fiction, television episodes and all that, Netflix series, you will find that they have always dreamt of a contagion that would defeat the world, a contagion that would change its shape. And each time, it's like a sort of a running race. Each time science and medicine came close to capturing it, this would change its shape and put itself forth in another form. That is why it is called a dream. And this dream has recurred in the form of science fiction narratives, which now are called prophetic narratives in a different sense. So, you have this book called Contagion, written by Bashford and Hooker. Don't worry, I'll send you the title. And I'll just briefly talk about this book. And I want to talk about this book because it saves me a lot of trouble of having to explain interdisciplinarity. You get the complete idea of what interdisciplinary approach is when I talk about Bashford and Hooker's Contagion. The chronological and epistemological schema of modernity and postmodernity can be mapped onto colonialism, post-colonialism. So they are connecting the ideas of modernity with colonialism and post-modernity with post-colonialism. And there is a nexus, according to Bashford and Hooker, of modernity, biomedicine, and colonialism. So, you talk about the Enlightenment, you talk about the European modernity, and there you always, within modernity, you have this idea of the Enlightenment. But the crucial question was, which were the bodies that were included within this project of enlightenment? And to study infectious diseases in a historical manner is also to question and make visible the processes and concept of colonization. For like contagion, colonization is about contact, self-multiplication, and not very rare, also destruction. I hope you have got the feature matrix clearly in your mind. This is the problem with an online class, because I cannot draw on the board and explain it. I'm not that technologically savvy at this point of time. So to study infectious diseases, you're comparing it with the concept of colonization. And they say that, look at contagion and look at colonization. It's all about contact. With colonization, what comes into contact? The imperial power comes into contact with a native population. The contagion, the virus, comes into contact with the human body. Then there is multiplication. In the native population, initially just Vasco da Gama and a shipload of whites arrived, they multiplied. And the number very quickly increased. Much the same way, within the body of the human, the virus increases. And sometimes the virus destroys the human. And in the case of colonialism also, native populations were often completely destroyed. Now, there is a three-way travel of terminology between national or imperial governance, infectious disease, and laboratory medicine. And this is just one indicator of the completely, entangled histories of biomedicine and imperialism. I hope you understand. So you have the governance on one side. It may be an imperial governance or it may be a national governance. And you have the infectious disease on the other side and the medical facilities or the technology of the medicine on the other hand. And let us look at the three categories here. The colony of bacteria on the Petri dish. Petri dish is the sort of vessel that you use in a laboratory to look at bacteria. So and the word is also the colony of bacteria. If you look at the medical terms, they would actually identify it as a colony of bacteria. And there are not just colonies like India and Bangladesh. There were also leper colonies in the night. Like you have Foucault, who speaks about colonies of tubercular patients, and you have also leper colonies. And the defense of the immune self, of the immune community or nation from external invasion. So I hope you understand. You have colonies of bacteria, you have colonies of leprosy patients, and you have the defense of the body and or the community from external invasion. So this is how Bashford and Hooker sort of talk about this. And to connect it to immunity, you have what is known as diplomatic immunity. Certain people who can visit places, certain places, you get into the idea of people who are privileged, people who have, even when there is a lockdown imposed, certain people are always exempt from these rules of the lockdown. And on the other hand, you have the resistance of the colonized people and the resistance of the individual embodied subject to the invading disease. And the global distribution of hegemonic practices of Western biomedicine, as well as this crossover of concepts, situates the very notion of contagion inside the history of imperialism, colonialism, and the history of biomedicine. When I give you this example, perhaps it might make more sense. So you have Philip Anderson, who studied American colonialism in the early 20th century Philippines. And he reveals the imperative of health to be an effective way of constructing and maintaining boundaries between colonizers and colonized, a way of creating the otherness of colonized territory and people. And Anderson details the process by which contagion and its management created an American colonial identity by regulating the conduct and producing and sustaining wider social relationships. So, American physicians and public health experts installed a culture of hygiene and sanitary inspection of indigenous Filipinos. So, the colonial agents of America, they were American physicians and public health experts. So, according to Anderson, they install a culture of hygiene, and thereby they can go into the places where Filipinos are living and subject them to inspection on the basis of telling them whether they can be categorized as hygienic or unhygienic, healthy or unhealthy bodies. Anderson details the effects of this culture in terms of creating a colonial identity of cleanliness, which implied greater security and safety, in contrast to a native population identity, the Filipino identity of contamination, in which ceaseless regulation of social life and personal conduct was apparently required. So the role of the government in creating health practices which served to distinguish the colonized from the colonizers was also discussed by Bashford and Nugent in their study of leprosy management. Their essay shows how complicated public health was in the work of colonization as well as nationalism in the early and mid 20th century Australia. The governance of colonial populations through public health was racialized. That is, health governance doubled as and was inseparable from racial governance. Showing the centrality of colonialism, metaphorical as well as literal, to ideas of contagion is also part of Bashford's purpose in writing this essay. She suggests that 19th century smallpox vaccination was partly shaped by Orientalist colonial discourse, and that this persists in the historiography through which we are asked to understand the history of vaccination. So government of the healthy self has become, over the 19th and 20th centuries, not only an imperative of a Western colonial movement, but a deeply internalized expression and assertion of subjectivity. A pivotal object of analysis in cultural studies, subjectivity was taken up significantly by Foucault in terms of what he called care of the self. Like I said, the self-surveillance that is set in motion by the arrival of a contagion. So we need to look at the relation between individual embodied subjectivity and other social bodies, for example, communities as well as nations, as well as analyzing the mechanisms by which individuals form their own sense of self by differentiating from others. We ask how infectious diseases and the management, in conjunction with the use of contagion and its web of signifiers, is implicated in the formation and subversion of selfhood. You just think about the idea of the American intrusion into Philippines and how quickly they managed to establish a binary, which meant that being American meant that you were hygienic, you possessed a healthy body, and the Filipinas were categorized as unhealthy, therefore insecure body, and they were running the risk of being contaminated by the native population. So how, why, and with what effect does the question of identity imply in the question of the contagion? Writers in multiple traditions have all noted that a primary mode for understanding and asserting the individual self has been through the ideas of cleanliness and containment. And this is what Julia Kristeva termed the clean and proper body. Now, this again has multiple ramifications. You think about certain sexual practices like homosexuality, like lesbianism, and certain bodies like transgender bodies, which were not considered to be the clean and proper body, and how these bodies were criminalized. It was spoken of as diseases, and then they are also criminalized. The same thing is happening, right? You look at the COVID situation. If you transgress the rules, you're automatically becoming a criminal because you're being punished. Therefore, if you run the risk of contaminating a population, then you are punished, which makes you a criminal. And therefore, I hope you understand the multiple ramifications of what Kristeva has called the clean and proper body. So ill health implies loss of self into some sort of other. And these processes of loss of self have been conceptualized through metaphors of infection. Yes, and I guess I will just take a 1 second, and I'll try and sort of bring in Foucault at this point of time and talk about the notion of the biopolitics with which Foucault's idea has been very brilliantly used in our understanding of the contagion. Just give me a couple of 15 minutes more. So Foucault's concept of biopolitics assumes the dissociation of life from its concrete physical bearers. So the idea of biopolitics did not originate with Foucault. It was already used. I am just focusing on Foucault's use of the terminology, okay? And objects of biopolitics, so people on whom the practices of biopolitics are imposed are not just single human beings, but they're taken as, an aggregate. Their biological features are measured and aggregated on the level of populations. So it's not on a single body that you're focusing on, but rather on the categorization of an entire population. So this procedure, please do connect it to the contagion, okay? This procedure makes it possible to define norms, what is right and what is wrong, establish standards, what is better and what is best and what is not good at all, and determine within this rating scale, you determine average values. As a result, life has become a measurable factor as well as a collective reality that can be epistemologically as well as practically separated from concrete living beings and the singularity of individual experience. So before going very deep into it, let's just look at the notion of the panopticon. So I'm sure all of you would have read about how Foucault has used the notion of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon in order to problematize the idea of surveillance and power, and how a notion of the gaze controls the behavior of the human body. But that actually created a paradigm shift, whereby we were asked to look at the concept of surveillance. But then, when technology became so advanced, and you sort of slowly move to Baudrillard's idea of the simulacrum and the simulacra, and the idea of surveillance, which is everywhere, big data, and the all-seeing eye of the camera, which is present, the omnipresent camera's eye. You have these CCTVs installed everywhere on the surface of the earth, you could say. Therefore, the structure of the panopticon becomes unnecessary. It is sort of eliminated. The necessity of the panopticon is eliminated because this gaze is there everywhere. And when you bring it into the context of this COVID pandemic, which all of us are very, very familiar now, we realize that it is not just surveillance from the other, it is surveillance of the self also, which has become very, very important. We were always obsessed with the human body. We were always obsessed about the way we looked, the way we smelled, the way we spoke. All these things were there. Along with that, we were asked, take your temperature. Are you feeling breathless? These questions. So self-surveillance becomes very crucial in this process. And we are allowing ourselves to be surveilled. We want our governments to become strong. We do not want any laxity. We want the neighbor to be watched as much we want ourselves to be watched. We want to be monitored. So again, like to borrow this terminology from Agamben, we are situated in a state of exception. And therefore, the idea of surveillance, far from being something to which we are subjected to, is something we are demanding. So these are the dynamics of change that has occurred within the state of exception. And in order to understand that, we have to look at how biopolitics has problematized the human body as such. And these are a couple of books which are very, very informative. For example, what is, again, Susan Sontag's idea of illness as a metaphor, and this one, which I spoke about now, Bashford and Hooker's, the name of the book itself is Contagion. Very interesting to read. So, Foucault's, I spoke about that. You use the term biopolitics is not consistent. That is one thing that you must remember, that he uses it in a variety of ways. So biopolitics stands for a historical rupture in political thinking. It is characterized by the re-articulation or the reframing of sovereign power. Next, Foucault assigns to biopolitical mechanisms a central role in the dynamics of modern racism. Not the racism that we found earlier, but contemporary model of racism. And third meaning of the concept refers to a distinctive act of the government that historically emerges with social regulation and individual self-governance. So the idea, the taboos that we internalize, that is part of individual self-governance, and that is caused by social regulation, again connected to the ideological state apparatus and the repressive state apparatus, which brings into being this code of conduct, which we can call social regulation, and this leads to individual self-examination and individual self-governance as well. So Foucault actually distinguishes two basic forms of this power: the disciplining of the individual body and the regulatory control of the population. The disciplinary technology to supervise and control the individual body had emerged, according to Foucault, from the 17th century. You can see it very, very clearly. Right. So let's just look at the model of power, that the four models of power that Foucault has spoken about, and then we'll open for discussion. At the end of I first spoke about the leprosy model that Foucault actually spoke about, where complete containment, because it was a highly contagious disease, and leprosy patients, the moment they were identified, were put into a ghetto sort of thing, a colony of lepers. And at the end of the Middle Ages, history tells us that leprosy disappeared from the Western world, but it did not disappear completely. The infirmaries or the leprosoria, which means the place where these people diagnosed with leprosy were interned, they were emptied to make room, according to Foucault's quite controversial thesis, for the exclusion from society of the poor, the sick, and the mad. So always we had to have a particular area into which the bodies that were marked as deviant could be locked up. So the leprous area that became houses for the poor and mental asylums in the modernity were for Foucault a first model of power. Power that separates the healthy from the sick, excludes the deviant and the mad from society. It is ideally outside the city gates, and therefore no longer does anybody care about them. The next was the plague model. In early modernity, the leprosy model was superseded by a model of power, which emerged around the fear of the plague. So Foucault develops this model in a 75-book Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. He argues that since the 17th century, a new regime of power emerges, which is disciplinary power. Deviants were no longer simply excluded and locked up. Everyone, these deviants, all right, were subjected to a rigorous discipline that served not as a practice of strict work, thus making a productive use of their bodies. So unlike the leprosy model, the plague model actually did not allow them to rest. The plague model made them work. So Foucault proposed this model for a dark vision of totally administered society for the administrative response to an infectious disease. So I quote, "If it is true that the leper gave rise to the rituals of exclusion, to a certain extent it provided the model for the great confinement. Then the plague gave rise to disciplinary projects." I hope you understand this. The two diseases which are being used as models of power. So don't just imagine it is just about the disease that Foucault is talking. He's talking about the larger framework of the mechanics of power systems. And if you look at the leprosy model gives rise to confinement. So you're pushing them out of the city gates, locking up the gates, and you forget about them. The only problem is you're not allowing them to come out. In the plague also, there is confinement. But along with confinement, you are taking close notice of what these bodies are doing. And you're paying close attention to them because you want these bodies to be productive at any cost. So that is the plague model. Right. The early modern plague regulations, he cited, design a system of uninterrupted control of all the borders and the crossings in the city and demands strict confinement of citizens inside their home. Every individual is fixed in his or her place. If he moves, he does so at the risk of his life or contagion or punishment. Then you have the third model. The third model is quite different. So Foucault now, it is said that, had slightly altered his perspective. And he talks about the smallpox model. And it seemed to be increasingly implausible to conceive modern societies on the model of a great disciplinary machine. So in his analysis of modern governmental rationality, the primarily economic freedom of individuals emerged in a new way as something irreducible, something absolutely fundamental. So he developed a new model, smallpox or inoculation practices. That is the history of vaccination also, that was being referred to in the book written by Bashford and Hooker called Contagion. The smallpox model of power is essentially based on the abandonment of a dream to completely eradicate pathogens, intruders, and germs, and to survey society in depth, like in times of the plague. Just look at this. The smallpox model of power exists with the pathogen, so the vaccination, remember, and it exists with the pathogenic intruder. It knows of its existence. You're injecting the vaccination into the body, right? It collects data, compiles. Does it all seem familiar to you? It collects data, compiles statistics, wages medical campaigns that may take on the character of a normation, dividing into norms, disciplinizing the human body. But discipline can no longer be a reasonable goal of liberal power. Only where it nevertheless pursues this, where power wants to return from the smallpox model to the plague model, it becomes authoritarian and eventually totalitarian in approach. So when you look at the idea of the COVID, again, we are very, very, it is quite raw, and we are in the midst of it. So we do not actually have the wherewithal to theorize it. But there have been few attempts, and I'm just mentioning these attempts, the transitions and overlaps between different forms. So they say that the complete lockdown of Wuhan rigorously followed the plague model, and all lockdowns follow that model. And it shows that curfews are necessary when statistical knowledge cannot be gained. And that makes possible, once statistical knowledge can be gained, that makes possible the liberal smallpox model, where the human being exists along with the pathogen. And the plague model remains a threat, even a danger. And it includes, where countries where curfews imposed with military tanks, and you warn, perhaps if you have places like Israel where prominent voices warn of a coup that the president will enact under the pretext in the fight against COVID-19. All these things are there. And also includes that storage and evaluation of movement data of everyone carrying a mobile phone is unlikely to be easily relegated to a purely technical possibility after this crisis. The liberal smallpox model fundamentally and always requires that the power of the state be monitored with suspicion. So we are sort of moving on into this inoculation model and the smallpox model of power. So this was my intention in going so deeply into this idea to talk about how governmentality borrows from the notion of healthy and unhealthy bodies, which is a discourse generated by medicine. And when this is reflected in literature, you have people speaking about COVID art and COVID literature and all that, unless and until we understand the multiple ramifications of the body, as well as how the body is structured within the dynamics of power, these ideas that are reflected in literature will not probably make that much sense to us. I think this has been slightly intensive today. Therefore, I will stop now and I will take questions.